He held his cell phone with shaking hands. The message had already been written a few minutes ago, but he hesitated. "I'm divorcing you." This simple but brutal sentence carried the weight of months of pain, doubts and sleepless nights. She was now at that party, laughing, drinking, in the arms of another man. And he, the betrayed husband, waited in silence, ready to end it all. He knew exactly where she was. Every shared laugh, every touch, everything had been recorded in the last few months. It wasn't just any suspicion, it was a betrayal that he had been following, day after day, feeding his anger in silence, until he could no longer bear it. Deep down, he wondered, why her? Why did the woman with whom he had built a life, with whom he had dreamed of a future, throw herself into the arms of another? At first, he tried to ignore the signs. The frequent departures, the lame excuses, the empty looks when they were together. But the void she left in bed, at the dinner table, in conversations about the future, could no longer be ignored. The betrayal had become a permanent shadow, hanging over every silent moment between them. He wanted to believe it was just a phase, that she would come back to him. But over time, he realized that she was no longer there. She was gone long before she walked through the door that night. However, now, everything was about to change. With his finger ready to press send, he imagined her expression when she read those words. The pain he felt, she would feel. It wouldn't just be a message, it would be the beginning of a new phase, one where she would pay for every lie, every fake smile, every touch that was never intended for him again. He took a deep breath and hit send. At that moment, it felt like time stopped. Instantly, he knew she had read it. It didn't take long for the message read notification to appear. His heart was beating fast. Would she cry? Would you try calling? Or worse? Was he in his lover's arms while reading his farewell message? And then, the phone vibrated. He imagined her paralyzed, with her cell phone in her hands, sitting in some dark corner of the party, fighting to hold back her tears, while her lover didn't even notice. Or perhaps he noticed and took delight in her suffering. Would this be the last memory she would have of their wedding? The party, the lover, and the message that destroyed her life. He briefly wondered if that was enough. If her pain would be as intense as his. "I'm divorcing you." Simple, direct. But would that be enough? He wanted her to know everything. Of the months he watched her, of the moments he pretended not to know. He wanted her to feel the weight of his betrayal, for every word of that message to echo in her mind like a final sentence. She needed to understand what she had done. And then, the phone vibrated again. No response. Just silence. An overwhelming void. The message had been received, but was she still with him? Did you think about how to respond? Or perhaps, at that moment, she was deciding between staying with her lover or saving what was left of her life. He imagined her face, her teary eyes, her shaking hands holding her cell phone, while the loud music and laughter in the background seemed distant, unreal. What did she feel now? Blame? Repentance? Or just the same indifference he showed in recent months? And then, something new popped into his mind. A question he had been avoiding at all costs, but now tormented him. What was she going to do next? Would you go home and beg for forgiveness? Or would she simply disappear with her lover, leaving behind the life they built together? He stared at the phone for long minutes. The silence on the other side weighed more than any response she could give. The emptiness that once consumed him was now filled by a new sensation, something he couldn't name. It was revenge, mixed with the desire for an explanation, for a reason that might never come. The cell phone remained silent. There, in the back of his mind, a new doubt was forming. Something he couldn't ignore, a new layer of betrayal, perhaps even more cruel. And if? What if this betrayal had more consequences than he imagined? Something he could never predict. The void between them was about to reveal something much deeper, something he had never considered. The silence inside the house was almost suffocating. It was a stark contrast to what she used to be, the center of laughter, conversation, and plans for the future. The house with its light walls and minimalist decor, which had previously seemed welcoming, now had an almost hostile coldness. Every corner seemed to hold memories that, every day, became more distant and painful. The environment was impeccable, but there was something out of place, a lack of life, of presence. John and Emily had long been what many would call the perfect couple. They met at college, when they both dreamed of great careers and a prosperous life. John, always focused and determined, pursued a career in the financial sector, building a solid trajectory in a large company. His work ethic was admirable, but as the years went by, his dedication to his profession began to consume much of his time. Emily, on the other hand, always more sensitive and full of life, chose the path of the arts, working as a graphic designer. Their days were filled with creativity, while John's were filled with numbers and reports. Their marriage was the result of years of coexistence and love, and the foundations of this relationship seemed, at first glance, unshakable. They had a big house, frequent trips, dinners with friends. But while appearances kept everything in order, something began to crumble between them. In the early years, conversations were constant. They shared everything, dreams, frustrations, joys, and even the small details of everyday life. However, as John climbed the career ladder, his nights at the office became more frequent. Emily, in turn, filled her time with new projects and art galleries, where she always found a way to express her restlessness. The distance between them was almost imperceptible at first, a subtle absence that was hidden behind commitments and obligations. But over time, the space between the two grew, and the words that once flowed naturally were now replaced by longer and longer silences. John loved Emily, he had no doubt about that. But routine and work began to overshadow the small gestures that were previously part of his daily life. The flowers he used to buy on Fridays, the impromptu breakfasts, the late-night conversations about anything. All of that was left behind, without him even realizing it. And Emily, even though she was a patient and understanding person, began to feel his absence deeply. She found herself increasingly alone, in a house that no longer seemed as welcoming as before. Sometimes Emily tried to bring up old times. A candlelit dinner, a surprise with wine and music. But John was always tired, always with his mind elsewhere, promising that he would try harder on the weekend, promises that were almost never kept. Emily smiled, tried to understand, but deep down, she knew something was being lost. Something she didn't know how to get back. The distance was not physical. They were in the same place, they shared the same bed, the same roof, but they no longer seemed to share the same life. John was not a cold or cruel man. On the contrary, he cared about Emily, but the pressure of work and the search for financial stability seemed sufficient justification for his emotional absence. He blindly believed he was doing the right thing by ensuring a comfortable future for both of them. What he didn't realize, however, was that this idealized future no longer seemed so important without Emily's real presence. On the other hand, Emily struggled to fill that void. Sometimes he would sink into his work, seeking refuge in colors, shapes, and design. Other times, she tried to rediscover that love that, one day, had made her believe that nothing could separate them. But as the months passed, the feeling of loneliness intensified. She found herself looking at the past, trying to understand when everything started to change. John still looked at her with love, but his eyes no longer conveyed the same passion as before. It was as if they were both trapped in a kind of limbo, where life went on, but the feeling that united them was slowly fading. His closest friends noticed the change. Emily's laughs weren't as frequent anymore, and John was always too busy to attend meetings. When they went out together, there was a palpable discomfort, an invisible barrier that formed between the two, something they both felt but didn't know how to break. Banal conversations about everyday life replaced any attempt to discuss what really mattered. And when silence fell between them, it was as if they were both waiting for the other to say something that could heal that invisible wound. Emily, over time, started to move away. What was once an attempt at reconciliation now became an effort to find some peace within himself. She threw herself into projects, spent more time away from home and, from time to time, even avoided coming back for dinner. John noticed, but he was so caught up in his own obligations that he believed it was all just a phase. A phase that, he thought, would pass with time. But the phases also have their limits. And, no matter how much they both tried to pretend that their love was intact, the truth is that the wear and tear had already created cracks. Small, almost imperceptible, but enough for distancing to become a new reality. That night, as Emily was getting ready for another outing, John glanced at her, trying to remember the beginning of it all, how he fell in love with that woman with the easy smile and dreamy eyes. He wondered if it was still possible to rescue something. She, on the other side, had already set aside any expectation of change. And so, two worlds that were once perfectly intertwined began to silently disintegrate. Both followed their routines, their commitments, but what was previously shared between them now became individual, solitary. The gulf between John and Emily only grew, and without realizing it, each made decisions that would forever shape the destiny of their marriage. The weeks that followed were a blur for John. The routine continued unchanged, the exhausting work, the hours at the office and the oppressive silence upon arriving home. Emily, in turn, was increasingly distant. She spent less time at home, and when they were together, communication was limited to the basics. John saw the signs, but refused to confront reality. He knew deep down that something was wrong, but he didn't want to admit it. After all, he had dedicated so much of his life to building what they had. Failure was not an option. Emily, on the other hand, seemed to have given up on trying to fix anything. She didn't know exactly when it happened, but at some point, the will to fight for her marriage had been lost. Maybe it was John's lack of attention, or maybe something deeper. What she knew for sure was that she had found comfort where she shouldn't have. Initially, they were harmless conversations, a passing flirtation. But what started as an exchange of glances and laughter had turned into something she could no longer control. She met him during an art exhibition, one of those nights John had promised to attend but cancelled at the last minute. The excuse was the same as always, meetings and work. Emily wasn't surprised, but for the first time, she felt something different. He felt free. Without the expectation that John would be by her side, without the shadow of his absence. And it was that night that she met David. Tall, charismatic, with a smile that seemed to understand every part of her that John had forgotten. He was different from anything she knew. The conversations flowed naturally, first about art, then about life. David was funny, witty, and most importantly, he was present. He listened to every word she said carefully, something Emily hadn't felt in a while. It didn't take long for the attraction between them to become evident, a desire that Emily tried to deny, but which grew with each new encounter. And so, what was just an innocent friendship turned into something more. Emily knew she was pushing boundaries that she couldn't take back, but the feeling of being seen, of being wanted, was something she couldn't let go of. John, in turn, remained oblivious. He noticed Emily's absences, of course, but he preferred not to question it. In his head, they were still going through a phase. He believed that the love they had, no matter how frayed it was strong enough to overcome anything. And somehow he had convinced himself that waiting was enough. All it took was a little more patience for things to go back to the way they were before. But the distance between them was no longer a phase, it was a reality. And while he waited for a return that would never come, Emily was already involved in a path he couldn't even imagine. Emily's departures became more frequent. She always had an excuse, a work meeting, a meeting with friends, or a new exhibition. John accepted everything without question. Sometimes he was even relieved not to have to confront the emptiness he felt at home. Deep down, he knew something was wrong, but avoiding the pain seemed to be the only way out. That particular night, while John was buried in reports at the office, Emily was preparing to go out once again. She put on a red dress that she hadn't worn in a long time, arranged her hair carefully and looked at herself in the mirror. There was something strange about that preparation. For a moment, she found herself questioning her choices, but then she quickly pushed aside any trace of guilt. David was waiting for her. And at that moment, she preferred to ignore the consequences of her actions. When Emily arrived at the gallery where David was waiting for her, she felt a mixture of euphoria and nervousness. He was there, as always, with a welcoming smile that made her forget everything. The night progressed with conversations, laughter, and a growing intimacy that made it clear what would come next. Emily knew what she was doing, knew she was crossing a line that couldn't be undone, but in that moment, she chose to ignore the voice inside asking her to stop. And when the night finally ended, she didn't come home. John, on the other hand, was still in the office. Something about that night bothered him more than usual. Maybe it was the deafening silence in the house when he left, or maybe it was Emily's distant expression the last time they saw each other. He checked his watch once more. It was late, and Emily still hadn't given any news. Worry began to take over his thoughts, but along with it, came anger, an anger that he didn't know where it came from, but that grew with each passing minute. When he finally decided to leave work and go home, something in his mind was already starting to draw scenarios that he didn't want to believe. Arriving home, emptiness welcomed him. Emily wasn't there. He called her, no answer. His anger was growing, fueled by doubt, by distrust that he had been trying to ignore for months. He grabbed his keys and left again, determined to find her, even if he didn't know exactly where to look. Emily, at that moment, was with David, at a party. They laughed, they drank, without worrying about the outside world. But in the back of her mind, Emily knew she couldn't run away forever. She felt the weight of her choices, but at the same time, she was surrendered to that new feeling of freedom. And then, his phone vibrated. She took it out of her bag and, looking at the screen, felt her heart race. It was John. She knew she couldn't ignore him forever, but at that moment, all she wanted was to get away from her previous life, even if just for a few more hours. With a tightness in her chest, she put her cell phone back, trying to make the most of what little time she had left before reality caught up with her. John, on the other side of town, finally arrived at the gallery. And when he saw Emily's car parked there, his heart froze. John was breathing heavily, standing in front of the gallery where Emily's car was parked. His entire body seemed to shake, not only with anger, but also with a deep restlessness. He'd known something was wrong for months, but now he was about to have his worst fears confirmed. Every step towards the door felt like a fight against himself, as if a part of him wanted to run away, pretend it was all just a big lie. However, the other part, the one that was tired of ignoring reality, pushed him forward. As you entered the space full of people, your mind seemed to drift away from the conversations and music in the background. His eyes were looking for a single person, Emily. He passed smiling people, strangers greeting each other, unaware of the storm that was about to form. And then, there she was. In the corner of the room, next to a man John didn't know, but whose closeness to Emily was undeniable. They laughed, they talked with an intimacy he hadn't seen in his own marriage for a long time. John felt his stomach drop. Everything went in slow motion. His hand, once firm, squeezed the cell phone in his pocket, as if the simple touch could calm the storm in his chest. He watched as the man placed his hand on Emily's back, and she didn't hesitate to return the touch, a soft smile on her face. Here was the confirmation he never wanted to find. There, in public, in front of strangers, his wife gave herself to someone else. But what really stopped him was Emily's gaze. When she finally saw him, her eyes widened, and the color drained from her face. The conversation with the man next to him suddenly stopped. Reality collided with the fantasy she was living. For a second, the two stood still, staring at each other, as if everything around them had disappeared. Emily didn't know what to say, and John didn't know if he had the strength to confront her there, at that moment. The silence between them was louder than any words that could be spoken. Finally, John approached. His steps were heavy, each one as if he were walking towards his own abyss. He didn't speak right away. I didn't know where to start. But Emily's face, pale and speechless, said it all. She knew she was exposed. Her secret, the betrayal she tried to hide behind excuses and nights out, was now in front of them, impossible to deny. So, that's it. John's voice was low, but full of pain. He barely managed to keep his tone steady. The simple question summed up everything he needed to know. There were no accusations, no explosive anger. It was just the emptiness of someone who saw their world fall apart without warning. Emily swallowed. He looked at the man next to him, who looked uncomfortable, but didn't move. She tried to formulate an explanation, some justification, but words failed her. What could you say? What would explain all that? John. She began, but her voice was shaky, almost inaudible. There was nothing that could be said. They knew. They both knew. John took a step back, as if he needed room to breathe. Emily's words hit him hard, but what hurt him most was what she didn't say. She didn't apologize, she didn't try to deny it. She just stood there, still, knowing that everything had been revealed. He felt the crushing weight of what was left of their relationship fall on his shoulders. I knew it, John muttered, more to himself than to her. He looked around, the room seemed to remain the same, as if nothing was happening. People went about their lives, oblivious to the drama unfolding before them. John, however, felt crushed by the loneliness he always avoided admitting. Cheating wasn't just Emily being with another man, it was confirmation that he had been left behind long before he even realized it. Emily approached, hesitantly, as if searching for a way to fix what was broken, but John's eyes stopped her. He didn't want to hear excuses. There wasn't enough excuse in the world to erase what he had just witnessed. I can explain, Emily tried once again, her voice full of regret and fear. But John was already too far away to hear. He took another step back, more and more distant not just physically, but emotionally. He finally understood what he had been trying to ignore for so long. Their marriage was over. The betrayal wasn't just physical, it was emotional. It was the breaking of all the promises and dreams they once shared. No, you can't, John interrupted, his voice sharp. He knew that any explanation that came would be a futile attempt to alleviate the situation. He didn't want to listen anymore. The man next to Emily remained silent, as if he understood that his presence there no longer mattered. What mattered was what was already destroyed between John and Emily. John felt the weight of everything that was to come. The memories of happy times, the memories of a life they had built together, everything seemed distant now, as if it belonged to someone else. He turned around slowly, ready to leave. There was no more to say, there was no more to do. As he walked towards the door, he felt his cell phone vibrate in his pocket. It was a message. For a brief moment, he thought about ignoring it, but something made him stop and look at the screen. It was from Emily. And those few words would change everything. I'm pregnant. John stood still, staring at the message on his cell phone screen. The words seemed to dance before his eyes, impossible to understand at that moment. Pregnant. Emily was pregnant. He looked at her, still standing next to David, her eyes fixed on her own hands, as if she were afraid to look at him. The weight of those words was crushing. Everything he thought he knew, all the anger, the pain of betrayal, all of it was suddenly replaced by a new reality he wasn't ready to face. Pregnant. That was what changed everything. He approached again, his steps now heavy with uncertainty. Emily looked up, realizing he had read the message. The silence between them was now even thicker, filled with a new tension, something John didn't know how to deal with. As John tried to speak, but the words failed him. He felt a lump in his throat, a mixture of shock and confusion. The anger that once drove him was now replaced by a deep fear of the unknown. How did this happen? He repeated, almost as if he were speaking to the void. Emily stepped forward, breathing deeply, trying to find the strength to speak. I found out a little while ago. I didn't know how to tell you. His voice was fragile, as if it could break at any moment. She knew this revelation changed everything, but not in a way that could fix what was broken. John looked at the ground, processing the information. He didn't know what to feel. The idea of Emily being pregnant, of having a child with her, was something that would once have filled his heart with joy. But now, in the midst of betrayal, it felt like an emotional trap he couldn't escape. Whose is it? The question came out colder than he intended. It wasn't just a curiosity question. It was a visceral need to know if this child was his, or if Emily had betrayed him in every possible way. Emily hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. She knew that was the inevitable question. I knew any answer would be painful. I don't know, she said finally, her voice broken by the truth she herself could barely accept. I'm not sure. John felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. The question of paternity was a torture he had never considered facing. His gaze met Emily's, who was now on the verge of tears, and for a moment, he realized the weight this had on her too. But empathy was quickly replaced by anger. He couldn't believe he had been reduced to this, to a man who didn't know if the child his wife was expecting was his. The man next to Emily, David, took a step back, visibly uncomfortable. He knew his presence there was a reminder of betrayal, and perhaps also of doubt about paternity. John, however, couldn't even look at him. All he saw was Emily, his wife, the woman he thought he knew but now seemed like a stranger. John was silent for a long time after Emily's revelation. The room around him seemed to spin, but at the same time, he felt completely still, as if the weight of everything that had happened was keeping him trapped. His mind couldn't properly process what that meant. It wasn't just Emily's betrayal, but the doubt, the cruel uncertainty about the child she carried. And that doubt was tearing him apart in ways he never thought possible. He took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts, but the pain seemed ever present. Emily's gaze was fixed on him, waiting for some reaction, some word that could break the silence, but John didn't know where to start. Part of him wanted to just run away, leave everything behind. But there was another part, one that was paralyzed, caught up in the possibility that the child was his after all. He couldn't ignore this chance. I didn't know how to tell you, John, Emily said in a broken voice, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't just sorry for the betrayal, but for the chaos that now engulfed them both. The future they had imagined together was shattered, and in its place were just a series of unanswered questions. John closed his eyes for a moment, trying to block out the world around him. He wanted time, space to think, to process what was happening. But Emily's words, the pain in her voice, the weight of betrayal, it all hit him like a blow. There was a storm inside him, of anger, of confusion, but also of a love that, no matter how hurt he was, still existed in some way. You weren't sure? John finally asked, his voice low but filled with disbelief. It was a simple question, but it carried immense emotional complexity. He wasn't just asking about paternity. He was questioning the entire basis of their relationship. Questioning how they had gotten there. Emily shook her head slowly. I wanted to believe it was yours. But I can't be sure. Not after everything. The confession, although honest, hurt him even more. John felt betrayed not just by his actions, but by the lack of clarity, the doubt that now hung over everything. Physical betrayal was one thing. He could have gotten over it with time. But the uncertainty about her son, about what she really felt, that was something he didn't know if he could forgive. And what did you expect? John asked, his voice now filled with bitterness. That I would just accept it. That I would look at you and pretend everything is okay. Emily bit her lower lip, unable to respond immediately. She knew that nothing she said would change what she had done. And the only thing she could offer now was her sincerity, even if it caused more pain. I didn't know what to do, she admitted, her voice fragile. I was confused, alone. I made a mistake, but I love you, John. I always have. Silence settled in again. John stared at her, but he no longer knew who she was. The woman he loved was there, in front of him, but at the same time, she seemed like a complete stranger. And the love she said she had sounded empty in the face of everything they had lost. Love? John laughed bitterly, taking a step back. Is this love to you, Emily? Lying, hiding, leaving me believing that we still had a chance. Emily was crying now, her shoulders shaking. I never wanted to hurt you, she whispered. I just didn't know how to stop. John felt the anger rising again, but it wasn't the explosive anger he had felt upon seeing Emily with another man. It was a deeper, more contained anger, one that came from the feeling of emotional betrayal that consumed him. He looked at her, at the woman he had chosen to spend the rest of his life with, and realized that something inside him had changed. Maybe forever. It's not just about what you did, John finally said, his voice cold but firm. It's about what you destroyed. You destroyed the trust, the respect. I could even forgive the betrayal, Emily. But this doubt, about the baby. I don't know if I can live with that. The words fell heavy in the air between them. Emily didn't know what to say. There was no erasing what she had done, and now all that was left was the uncertainty of the future. She knew John was devastated, knew he had every right to be furious. But at the same time, she couldn't shake the fear of losing him completely. Because no matter how much she had betrayed him, she still loved him. But her love now seemed insufficient. John turned his face to the side, unable to continue looking at her in that state. He knew that the decision he needed to make would be the most difficult of his life. And he knew that no matter what he chose, life as he knew it was over. The question now was, what would he do next? What was left for him when everything he had believed in was destroyed? The moral dilemma that consumed him was overwhelming. Could he accept the situation, try to rebuild what was lost, even knowing that perhaps the child Emily expected was not his? Or would he simply cut all ties, walk away once and for all, and start his life over again, without her? These were questions he couldn't answer at the moment. All he knew was that, in that moment, he needed air, needed space to understand himself. John took another step back, keeping his eyes fixed on Emily, before slowly turning around. He needed to get out of there. I needed to think, breathe. And perhaps, in the process, discover what to do with what was left of his heart. The days that followed were deafening silence. John didn't come home that night. He needed space, needed to get away from everything he knew. The impact of Emily's revelation destroyed him from the inside out. The doubt, the betrayal, the feeling that his entire life had fallen apart kept him in a kind of emotional suspension. He wandered the streets, avoiding contact, avoiding even thinking about how to deal with what had happened. Emily, in turn, was left alone in that house, in the same place where they had built a life together. The silence between the walls echoed the mistakes she could no longer fix. Regret consumed her, but what tormented her most was the fear of what was to come. The baby, the uncertain future, the possible loss of John, everything mixed together, making each day an endless torture. John was gone for weeks. Each day was an internal battle, an attempt to understand what he should do. The idea that the child Emily was carrying could be another man's was unbearable, but there was a part of him that couldn't just cut all ties. The love he felt for her, despite everything, still existed. It was an uncomfortable truth, one he couldn't shake. Finally, after a long time, John made his decision. He returned to the house, and upon entering, he found Emily in the living room, sitting in the same place where they had shared laughs, plans and dreams so many times. But now the atmosphere was filled with an almost suffocating tension. Emily slowly stood up when she saw him. The fear on his face was clear. She knew that the moment had come, and that any decision John made at that moment would define their fate. John looked at her for a long time before finally speaking. His voice was calm, but there was a firmness to it that Emily didn't recognize. "I can't go on like this," he began, and the words seemed to cut through the silence like blades. "I thought about everything that happened, everything we were, and what we can still be. But I can't live with that doubt. I can't look at you and this child without wondering all the time if he's really mine." Emily, with tears in her eyes, tried to speak, but John interrupted her. "I'm not here to hear excuses or explanations. That's over. What we had ended when you chose to hide everything from me. I loved you, Emily, I really did, but you broke that in ways I don't know can be fixed." The pain on Emily's face was palpable, but John held firm. He continued, feeling the need to end that part of his life once and for all. "I'm going to file for divorce, and you're going to move on with your life. I hope that, for your own sanity, you find out who the father of this child is. But I can't be part of this anymore. I can no longer live in this uncertainty." The weight of those words settled between them. Emily broke down, bursting into tears, but John didn't relent. The decision was made, and he knew it was the only path that made sense for him at that moment. The days that followed were fast and cold. The divorce was processed without much conflict, and John completely withdrew from the life they had shared. He started his life again in another city, far from all the memories that imprisoned him. It wasn't an easy process, but every day he felt the weight ease a little more. Emily, in turn, decided to continue with the pregnancy. A few months later, she discovered that the baby was not John's, which only confirmed that her destiny was now completely separate from his. She raised the child alone, with the support of family, but the regret for the betrayal and the life she destroyed would stay with her forever. As for David, the lover, he quickly walked away when he learned that Emily was pregnant. The promise of something exciting and forbidden disappeared as quickly as the commitment he had never been willing to make. For Emily, the void he left behind was just another layer of pain. In the end, John moved on, a man marked but not broken. He learned, over time, that some wounds never heal completely, but that it is possible to move forward despite them. His life would never be the same, but he found peace in accepting that not everything in life can be controlled. And so, the cycle of their lives was abruptly and definitively broken. John, Emily and the son who would never be his continued on their separate paths, each dealing with the consequences of their choices. Life, as always, moved on, leaving behind the scars of a marriage destroyed by betrayal and doubt. Now that the story has come to an end, we want to know what you thought. Leave your comment with your opinions about the story and say if you were also impacted by the outcome. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and activate the bell so you don't miss any new videos. And remember, here on the channel, we do not support any type of betrayal, but we explore these stories to reflect on the complexities of human relationships. Until next time.